Hello guys, it's Sound the Husky here. Welcome back to the Death Masterclass series remastered. Today we are on chapter 1. Alrighty, this one is actually quite simple. This is the early to late game. Let's say transition from early to the mid game to the late game. I have a couple of slides here that are going to just sort of give you overviews, insights, strength, weaknesses, and some just basic things that you need to know about each part so you have a better understanding of each. So, what would be considered early, mid, and late game? It's very subjective, really, but I have found the best way to do it, in my opinion, could be either by gear sets, because there is certain gear sets that really give you extra power, that really power up your character as a whole, that I would think would be a lot good, would be a great way to, of course, classify it. But you could also split it into the different arcs of the game. So, early game, in my opinion, would be mostly all of Arc 1 and some of Arc 2 up to level 60. And I say level 60 because of a gear set that I call, well, you probably know it well if you've played a long time, Waterworks. One of the best sets ever at level 60. Also, there is the set at the end of Celestia you can get, which is also pretty solid. You can mix and match both to really get some good damage output and stats. But we will cover that in the gear section, of course, and into Arc 3. This would be the mid game, or, well, end of Arc 3, which is Imperia, or what you would call the Grandfather Spider part of the game. And then, of course, late game is Arc 4 and beyond, the design saga, I would call it, starting in Caramel, then Lemuria, Novus, then Wallaroo, Selenopolis, and now Darkmoor, starting off the first world of Arc 5 with Miranda Briar. Anyways, you will see consider damage. What the hell did I just say? I'm keeping that in there. That was funny. You'll see significant. My God, I can't speak today. Well, it is midnight, so that's one fault. Don't record at midnight. Duh. Okay. But you'll see significant damage curve increasing of your output in damage, and stats are also going to be significantly different between the stages. I don't have any examples, but I will introduce and implement some examples when we get into the gear section, which will be the next chapter of this masterclass. Okay, so early game, strengths, weaknesses, and a little overview. So there's not really a lot of weaknesses I could go over because there's only one definitive real weakness to Death at the early game, so we'll cover that after I go over the two strengths. One, drains. Drains are the best thing ever. Death's drains will always keep them very healthy when fighting enemies. It may feel a little tough when your main healing outputs are only, of course, single target, but you still have great survivability alongside this. Most survivability school life obviously can self-heal themselves. Death can almost do it just as well, maybe sometimes better, with their drains. Like I said during the intro, all the damage you do, you get 50% of that damage back as health whenever you use a drain. The next strength is you have one of the highest, you will have a lot more power pip chance than some other schools, and you have the second highest accuracy of any school, tied with balance at 85. The highest accuracy school obviously being life with 90%. So there are 4 other schools that have lower, of course, accuracy than you do. That being Myth, Ice, Fire, and Storm, which have Myth and Ice have 80, Fire has 75, and then, of course, Storm has 70, since they have the highest damage. Okay, now, we go over the 2 little strengths you have, but Here's a weakness. Lack of a definitive AoE. Okay, so let's list off the AoEs for the other schools. Balance has Sandstorm. Myth has Humongo Frog. Fire has Meteor Strike. Blizzard for Ice. Tempest for Storm. Life doesn't have one either, which is a shared weakness between the two most survivability schools. Life having their self-heals, Death having their drains. They don't have their AoE hit that's really strong until level 48. And then, of course, all the air schools get their super strong AoEs as well. So, fights can feel a little bit drug on, especially in the later worlds like Dragon-Inspired Mushu, before you hit 48, if you're not prepared with a good setup, but it can be counteracted, which we will go over once we go over the gear section, of course, once again, Chapter 2. So, don't need to worry about this weakness. We can counteract it, and I will sort of go over that when we get to that next chapter. Now, another thing that isn't really a weakness, but it is something to note, you may feel your damage on the drains can be a little low. 160 on Ghoul, 335 on Vampire. And then, of course, Wraith only has 500. But that's the main trade-off that you're taking when you go with a Death. Your AoEs, your drain spells are going to have less damage per pip than your normal hits, like Banshee does up to 305, which is about the same as, I think, Locust Swarm. Or Skeletal Pirate does around 590 damage on its high end, which is more than Wraith, and costs one less pip. But that is because drains are so strong that you don't need them to do super duper amounts of base damage. You can still add on damage from your gear and such to really boost that damage anyways. So really having high base damage on your drains, it doesn't really matter. But, your survivability, once again, is always going to be solid, so you shouldn't really have too many problems in the early game, even without AoE, i.e. Scarecrow. Now, what to look for in the early game? And I think this is a good question, that, especially for early game. Simply put, invest in your damage, your health, and your power pip. Since most of the time, until the mid-game, you're not going to have universal resistance to the schools, so you're going to just have to trade in for having lots more health, power pip, and damage, where you don't actually have universal resist. Early game is all about having the most amount of health possible to keep you as topped up on health when you use your drains. So to do this, obviously go to the bazaar, find gear that works from the gold that you get from, of course, selling gear that you don't need, and then you also accumulate gold over time. It's not a lot, but it does add up over time, especially if you're just constantly getting at it. Once again, we'll go over the whole thing about gear and such when we get to that section, but I thought it would be good to note that we do talk about gear in the bazaar for the sort of tip, because that's where you're mostly going to find your stuff in the early game. Either way, moving on. Also, make sure to keep up with trained spells. Obviously, once in a while, if you have your tutorial tips on, your professor will call you, i.e. Dworgen or Malorn, depending on what part of the quest line you're on. Levels 1 through 16, you'll go to Malorn. After that, then you'll go to Dworgen. Because there's a spell that you are going to want that is going to be a godsend when you get it, and that is Feint. Obviously, we all know Feint. The big 70% trap that significantly helps your damage output, especially in the early game. And it also does a lot in the mid and late game too. This thing scales very well. And it's not even a damage hit. It's a utility spell, which is amazing. Amazing. At the cost of a single pip, and you have a 30% trap put on yourself. You will always be able to out-heal the damage that you take from that hit into the 30 trap with that 70 trap you put on, and then hitting him with your maybe double buffed Wraith. You're going to out-heal that damage taken 100% of the time. let's go. Now, we've hit the mid game. Here are your strengths and weaknesses and your sort of overview. First strength, AoE. Heals a lot more in multi-enemy fights than you did in your single target, when you're doing your only single target damage. Because, let's say you have 3 enemies. Each of them take 4,000 damage, right? So, you get 2,000 from 1, 2, 3. 6,000 health in total from those 3 enemies alone. 4, that's now 8,000 damage that you're healing. So you deal 4,000 to each person, which is 16,000. Cut that in half, 8,000. Which is insane. Like I said here, i.e., more enemies hit, more healing back. Voice crack, I heard that. But also crit. So that 16,000 that you did, that 4,000 to each enemy, you crit, you do 8,000 to each enemy. Now you're healing. Instead, it's 32,000 damage taken from the enemies, and then you're healing back 16,000 health. Which you're never going to be able to overcap your health. That's not possible. But still, that is crazy to think that you can just out-heal anything like that. And that is one thing that the mid-game really shows you, is that Death's healing potential goes up exponentially with more enemies. Another strength, through gear optimization and such, once again, we'll talk about that, you will have close to near-perfect power-up chance and near-perfect accuracy with your gear, with a mix of gear, your pets, and your jewel sockets, which will always let you get your power pips quicker, which means you get your scarecrow quicker, which means you can get your hits off quicker, and you won't have to worry about fizzling so much, which is a win-win situation. But this isn't really a weakness. This is more of a sort of, I'd say, a neutral ground. Unlike fire, unlike storm, unlike myth, your damage output, damage per pip, is still not that good. You're not going to kill enemies as quick, which can be sort of tedious when you get into the late second arc worlds, i.e. Avalon, Azteca, Chrysalis, where bosses seem to have a lot more health than normal, making them feel like sort of these giant meat shields, where they just take so much time to kill that it feels very tedious and like a slog, requiring obviously more time to deal with them. And if you are somebody who doesn't have a lot of questing time, this can really slow down your progression. Now, you do have sort of this sweet spot here where your damage and survivability sort of comes together in a nice sort of, hey, this is way better than most schools could say for themselves at this point. Scarecrow being one of the strongest spells in the game, hands down, it can carry you through a lot of these fights throughout the mid-game, which you did not have going into the early game, which is definitely a big plus. But there is some mid-game woes. As I said before, there are some worlds, Avalon, Chrysalis, and Azteca in particular, that feel like a sort of trudge or a slog because your damage is good, but the damage compared to the health of the enemies makes them feel like damage sponges. And makes you feel like you may need to put in more blades and traps and, what have you. But fret not, all wizards go through this. Every school will go through this. Middle game, just like you. If you are able to get, if you just keep at it, keep sort of chipping away at it, you'll see hold on. You will soon find this, at the end of it all, you'll finally hit the late game, and you'll feel very satisfied with yourself because you got through some of the hardest challenges that you really have gone through as a wizard. I feel like the final worlds of the second arc really are sort of a test of your mettle because not only is it physically taxing on you, it's mentally taxing on you. So, that's just how it is. Which I'm not going to keep beating around beating the horse here, but you know, just know that everybody's gonna go through this. You're fine. You're Death. You're fine. You'll get through there with a lot more ease than some people. Just keep that in mind. Now, here we are, the late game. Most schools really don't have any real weaknesses here. Now, if you are lacking gear or a good pet and stuff, this can slow down your leveling, or it might not, because really, at this point, your damage, even without, a good pet or even some optimal gear, if you just have at least one or two pieces, you're still going to deal good damage. You're still going to be able to survive hits. You're not really going to struggle that much. Now, let's say you do feel like you need to take, you feel like you're just not doing that much damage, or you feel that you're not living as much. Then, go for it, and I would say this is the best point to really stop questing and focus on building your pet, obtaining gear, because really at the late game, you're pretty much caught up with most people in terms of, progression. I think most of the player base, especially on PC, I don't know what the console looks like in terms of where everybody is in terms of worlds, but most people are in the third arc or the fourth arc, the fourth, fifth arc. They're in the late game. So you really won't have to worry about people, not having people that if you want to try and duo with somebody or trio or just have a team, go through the final worlds, you will most likely be able to find people. Once again, we'll go over the gear in the next chapter, but, there you go. Now, true late game potential. Now, upon hitting late game, I'd say the late game is probably the most fun because this is when you can really start min-maxing your stats. So hitting damage cap, you could go straight for the damage cap. Get every inch of damage out of your gear as possible. So your damage goes through the roof, and that scarecrow just hits even harder than it did. Because that's really fun. Because for some of people, myself included, I like seeing big numbers when I hit. It's gives you that sort of melatonin, right? It gives you that stimulus. But, that's one way to do it. Or you could go for a sort of mix where you have very good damage, but you also have that nice resistance. So you're actually a lot more tankier, but you still do a ton of damage. You can really limit test your character in the late game. And that's what I think real late game potential is how well can you min-max or how well can you limit test your character. And I think Death can do it the best because of its drain ability. But I think other schools can do it as well. I could say Fire and Storm could do this as well in late game because of one thing, and that is pins. Late game pins that go on your hat, robe, and boots, there are sword pins. And Death and Storm and Fire can hit some crazy secondary school numbers with pins. So I'm just saying, they could do some pretty good stuff too. So basically, there's really no one way to play in the late game. So there's really not a lot of stuff. But if you set up optimally and sort of have a sort of correct or just really up to date setup, you're basically unkillable and you can get through anything that's thrown at you. You are literally a self sustaining wall of, undeath. You will never die. I'm not going to quote Mercy because that might get copyrighted by Overwatch. Anyways, so after all that, what are some things to take away from this? Your early game is really your weakest point in most terms, but you're still able to sustain yourself with your drains, so really, it's not the worst. Mid game is all about surviving the long drawn worlds to reach the power spike that comes with getting out of those worlds, like Darkmoor, Castle Darkmoor, and then going further beyond that with, the Merciless set from, Lemuria, the Aeon gear, then the Wallaroo set, and then finally now the Darkmoor set, and even other gears that go into that sort of level 170, 180 templates, right? Late game is when you're at your strongest, and you'll get to really this flow state. I would just call it a flow state. Yeah, you get into this flow state in the late game where you are just able to just roll. And that's what I think a lot of people really need to do when it comes to just questing. And I'll probably make a little tips and tricks thing at some point. But for now, we'll just leave it at that. So, transitioning through the early to mid to late game does have points where you will see, you can actually see the changes of your progression and your damage and your, everything. You'll be able to see your sort of transition period between early to the mid to the late game. Because, your strength at the end of the day comes down from your gear, the spells you have in your deck, and also just your, just game knowledge. That's the end goal. The end goal will always have you trying to get the best and most amount of knowledge, where your knowledge, your strength, and, just overall skill set of the game meshes with your play. And once you hit that sort of flow, once again, gotta use the word, once you hit that sort of flow state, everything comes natural. Everything starts feeling just automatic. And don't fret, even if you aren't the strong, super-powered hitter, who cares? You still have great utilities. You have Virulent Plague. You have weaknesses. You have your Feint. You have Curse, which is another universal trap. And you also have, I think it's called, it was called Dark Pact. I don't know what they called it now. I think it's called Dark Tribute, where you take some of your health and you give somebody a blade. But you also have Sacrifice, which is Death's way of healing people. They take a little bit of health from themselves, and then they give somebody else a bunch of health. Pretty cool. But like I said, you'll always have your utility spells, so you will always have a purpose even if you aren't the main hitter. I know Death may seem like you should be the main character in every fight because you're Death. Trust me, I know that feeling. No, I'm kidding. I digress. But that was sort of a joke. But either way, you're always going to have a use. Whether it's, your feints, the curse, plague is also another good thing. And then also when we get into spellements and stuff, when we get to that section, there's some more utility there that can help you and help your team. Because at the end of it all, when it comes down to it, once you hit that late game, most of the late game content after you finish the story is all about team stuff, team-based things. You know, if you're not really a, big-time casual player, if you're more of a casual player, you're never going to really experience this type of stuff. But people that go through, like raids and stuff and other types of content like that, you're going to soon sort of want to be a little bit more knowledgeable on, what your role in the team is. But that will come over time. And I'll probably talk more about this when we get to Chapter 6, which will be the sort of miscellaneous stuff to add in. But, just remember that. Yep, you'll probably be solo for most of your adventure, but at the end of the day, there will come a time where you will be on a team, and then you'll get assigned a role that you've never played before. Maybe you have to be the tank. Maybe you have to be the setter, the setupper, the blader, the trap aficionado. Maybe your job is to set up hitter, but also put weaknesses on enemy, And that is just gonna come from experience. And the best time to really get that experience in is actually just doing it normally through questing. Once again, I'll probably talk about that in a little bit more depth when we get to Chapter 6. Because I think Chapter 6 is going to be a lot longer than the main 5. Either way, I think this is the last slide, if I'm not mistaken. It is. Okay, so that is going to be pretty much it. I don't think there's anything else left to add in this chapter, because I've covered all of the bases that I wanted to hit. But I will say one thing about, you may feel at times your scaling seems a little slow, or it just feels, a little, you just don't feel like you're really getting anywhere with your game plan, your gameplay. And we all get into that point. Trust me, when I first got to, Azteca and Avalon and Chrysalis, holy moly, I was not ready at all for what I was getting thrown at. What was being thrown at me. Between the high health that they had and just how quickly they could take your health down as well was quite shocking in my first sort of full round through those worlds. Especially in the mid-game. The mid-game is probably, you're sort of at your sort of weakest point in the early game, but the mid-game can be a lot tougher than the early game if you just don't get the right setup or the right, it really goes to show that the game, when I started playing, has changed a lot, really. Because, nowadays we have a lot of stuff given to us, A lot of good gear comes from, like, packs and stuff. You can get some great gear from packs. But also, farming has become a lot easier because there are people that are, like, super high level that will do team-ups with lower levels to help them get their gear. And that really wasn't around when I was around, or when I first started. So really, being able to make a guide like this really is really cool and all. But I'm not gonna go off on a tangent about it. But you know, just take what you've learned from this section, and hopefully it does help you sort of have some insight about, getting your transition periods and hitting on them. Because remember, you want to take one chapter at a time and then add it all together. And then at the end of it, you have this giant, then you have all this extra knowledge now ingrained into your gameplay that you can just throw at the game and get through it. No matter what level you are, no matter what school you are, even at times, a lot of the stuff that I talk about in this Death Masterclass, there are some things in the game, in these guides, that can be taken to other schools. So really, it does help your playbook for all schools as a whole, but the main focal point is, of course, death for this guide, of course. But either way, I think we will stop here so I don't go off on a huge tangent. So, this will conclude the first chapter of the Death Masterclass. Be sure to leave a like, subscribe if you're new. Be sure to check out the Discord server. I will be pinning a comment to the code. So you just do the discord.gg and then / and then the code that's in the pinned comments. And then you'll go and you'll see the coaching tab if you want some coaching. I am planning on doing coaching videos. If you are looking to get a coaching session from me, then what you do is you'll just fill out a small little thing. You'll just put your name, your wizard's name, and then, what school you are. I'm going to take any school, and I'll just sort of help you out. It doesn't have to be PvP. It can be PvE. It can be anything. Just send me a clip of you needing some coaching. If you need some coaching on stuff, I'll be glad to take it. I'll be glad to take it, analyze it, review it. And if you do happen to consent to it, I will put our coaching video, our coaching session, on this channel for other people to look at. Because that is another thing that is really helpful, is having material like that to watch and look at, because you can learn from other people getting coached as well. So I thought I would just talk about that a little bit. I will make a full video about the coaching in the coming days, where I will reference it in the art chapters. If you want to look for coaching, just, like I said, go into the Discord, find the coaching section, and then apply for coaching. It's simple. It'll probably only take you a couple minutes to just type it out, and there you go. And if you want me to just take a look at the clip, you can attach the clip. But if you want me to actually do the one-on-one in a voice call, we'll set it up. So either way, that will conclude Chapter 1 of the Masterclass. I will see you in Chapter 2, which will be coming out hopefully in the coming days. I will see you all next time. Have a good one.